how to make resin eye forms. In this video, we're going to cover the process of casting your own custom resin eye forms. Now, this is important anytime you're casting silicone masks or faces or props or whatever that have eye forms that will need to be inserted later and fit exactly into the silicone cast. Again, this is mainly useful when you're casting silicone dolls or prop heads or creatures, things like that, where again, you're going to have glass eyes that need to fit perfectly into the finished silicone cast. Now for today's video and today's example, I'll be using some alligator eye forms that I purchased from a taxidermy supply. These are little glass eye forms that are beautifully painted, and if you're like me and you don't want to sit around and make eyes, then you can order these through a lot of taxidermists like Van Dyke's Taxidermy. And these are great for sculpting creatures or corporate reptilian heads, whatever the circumstances might require. Now, because this is a hollow eye form, it does have a little pocket in the back, and that can trap air bubbles and release them into our silicone mold. So I'm going to fill that up with some Protolina clay, and that's a sulfur-free modeling clay that's just a good general purpose utility clay for this kind of application. And I'm just going to use that to stick that down to a piece of foam core board. So once I've done that, I'm going to use a dental tool to clean up around that outside edge. And that just gives me a nice clean eye form that I can now mold and then reproduce in hard plastic. Because the idea here is my finished eye form is going to have a hole drilled through the middle of it. So I don't want to waste expensive glass eyes for that process. Now, overall, this is a very simple molding and casting process, but this is one of those kinds of processes that when I describe it to people on the telephone machine, it's a little difficult to follow, but when you see the whole process start to finish visually, it's a very simple process. Now, what I'm doing here is, like you've seen a lot of our videos, I'm using one of our smaller mold tubes and just hot gluing that down. Now, this could easily be done with a little plastic cup or a Dixie cup flipped upside down and glued down the same way. But either way, we're making just a small containment area around our pattern and just hot gluing that into place. And now ready to release the inside of our mold tube and our pattern using some Zip 301 mold release. Now, really important here for two reasons. You want to make sure you're using a non-silicone mold release. And what that means is it does not contain silicone oil. And anytime you're going to be pouring silicone over a part, especially a glass part like this, you want to make sure you're using a mold release that does not contain silicone oil. So we're going to spray that again into that tube. Just a quick spray of that is all we need to release the tube and the pattern. And really important, that is a glass eye. So if we don't release this, the silicone will stick to it. So make sure we spray that and then give it time to dry or outgas. And we'll do that while we're mixing up our silicone. So now ready to mix up some 5110F. And this is the fast version of 5110. This is a low viscosity, fast setting silicone. This is a great silicone just to have handy in your shop when you're molding little parts like this, because this does set up so fast. And because it's low viscosity and one-to-one, easy to use, we can pour up a simple mold like this, in most cases without vacuum degassing. So here I'm just mixing up a very small batch of this. And one little tip here, when you're working with silicone, especially in small batches like this, and you want to make sure you get everything thoroughly mixed, sometimes it's a good idea to add a little pinch of silicone pigment. So here I'm going to add a little bit of our blue silicone pigment, just a little bit. And what that does, especially if you're new to working with silicones, that makes sure that you get everything evenly mixed. So when we get that silicone pigment thoroughly mixed and we get a nice uniform color, that's a good indicator that we have everything mixed up properly and ready to pour. And again, because this is such a simple mold, I'm not going to bother with vacuum degassing because this won't be used for any kind of pressure casting. I'm just doing this for a very simple resin form. So we're just going to pour in a thin stream in one spot and allow that silicone to fill that mold tube. And 5110F has a working time of about 8 minutes at room temperature, and then a demold time of about 1 hour at, again, room temperature, so around 70 to 75 degrees. So warmer climates will speed that up. Colder temperatures will slow that down. So important to remember here in the fine state of Texas, where we have lots of heat, which means lots of natural accelerator. Now, I did have a little bit of that silicone creep under that eye form, so I'm going to use a scalpel to trim that back. You could use an X-Acto knife or any kind of sharp instrument. Just, of course, remember that this is sharp, so you want to be careful not to sever any of your digits while you're doing that. And now our little resin eye form is ready for casting. And remember that the whole point of this is just to make some very simple resin eye blanks or eye forms to go into our sculpture. So the main point of this is that it is functional. So now we're going to pour up some fast setting TC802 casting resin. And TC802, the reason I'm using that for this particular project is this is a very fast setting, low viscosity resin formula that's 1-to-1 by volume, so very easy to mix this up in small batches. Now, it's important to not work in too small of a batch size when you're working with resin like this, because anytime you're measuring by volume, you want to be really careful to be as accurate as possible in these really small batches, because just getting out of ratio a little bit can throw that off and wind up with sticky, gummy parts. So I'm using that extra resin that I mixed up to pour into our gang mold of bolts we made in a previous tutorial. Now, TC802 has a demold time of around 10 minutes, so it doesn't take long at all for that to catalyze, and you'll see that it starts from the thickest mass and radiates out. Now, TC802 has about a 2-minute working time at room temperature and about a 10 to 15 minute demold depending on the cross section of the part. And that's important to remember, especially if you're casting small mechanical parts that have thin sections. Remember, the thin sections, they are an inverse of an air drying material. The thinner they are, the longer they take to cure. So the thicker mass areas, and here I'm pouring up the second eye form since we're doing a 2-eyed human creature. The thin sections will take a little bit longer, where thick sections will be faster. And you'll see that here again. It kicks off in the thickest part of the mass of the cast first, and then radiates out from that point. So once the little resin drips are set up and have turned white, that's a good indicator you're ready to demold your part. Now I'm going to use a drill press to drill some holes through these and run some hardware through it. And now we have our eye form ready to install in a new sculpture. Now, to illustrate how this works in the mold, here's a face mold that we use for testing silicones in our shop, and this is a TC1630 tooling resin mold. You see the little holes there to allow that hardware to come through and screw in or bolt on the other side. And these are a little different forms because these are for a different shaped eye form that have a little stem on the back. So I'll screw those into place and hold those into place with the little nuts. And then I use some Protolina clay to seal those up so silicone doesn't leak out those little holes. And for this cast, I was pouring up very soft 5100 silicone. 5100 is the softest of the 1-to-1 silicones we have in the BJB line, and that's a 0025, so very soft silicone that's ideal for casting silicone masks and dolls and that sort of thing. Now, once this sets up, what this does is by having those resin forms in place, when we demold our silicone part, we wind up with an allowance for our actual eye, our glass eye in this case, that can pop right into place. And these little glass eyes have those little stems on the back, and that's why I did those with an allowance for that in the resin cast. So there you have resin eye forms and how they can be used to create an allowance for the final glass eye in your finished casting. And this is a great process to be aware of if you do prop heads or creatures or masks that require glass eyes or creatures, anything like that that's going to require a glass eye inserted in the finished part. And of course, the 5110 Fast, the Fast Silicone, and the Fast Resin are available on our website, so be sure to check that out. All of the supplies from our videos are on our website at brickintheyard.com. And if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment for the algorithms. And of course, thanks for watching.